She arrived at Blackthorn Ranch with 43 cents, a leather satchel held together by a piece of wire, and the kind of pride that poor women in 1876 couldn't afford but couldn't survive without. The foreman looked her over the way men look at livestock, measuring, dismissing, and told her she'd be hauling water and mucking stalls at dawn. Not the bookkeeping work she'd been promised. Not anything close. Evelyn Hartwell had buried her father, lost her home, and ridden 3 days on a cattle wagon to reach this place. She wasn't about to let some sunburned foreman with bad teeth decide what she was worth. If this story speaks to you, like it and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The wagon that carried Evelyn Hartwell into Sweetwater County smelled of cattle dung and tobacco spit, and the driver hadn't spoken a word to her in 6 hours. That suited her fine. She wasn't in the mood for conversation. She was in the mood for surviving. It was late September 1876, and the Wyoming Territory looked nothing like what she'd imagined back in Boston. She'd pictured wide-open beauty, the kind of landscape people put in paintings. What she got instead was flat brown earth stretching to the horizon under a sky so vast it made her feel small in a way that had nothing to do with humility. The grass was the color of old straw. The wind cut sideways and didn't apologize. A hawk circled something dead a quarter-mile off the road, and the driver finally said something. "That's Blackthorn land, starts there." He jerked his chin toward a fence line that ran alongside the road, weathered posts leaning at irregular angles like old men who'd given up standing straight. "How far to the main house?" she asked. "Mile. Maybe 2. She pulled her coat tighter. It was a Boston coat, fine wool, meant for cold city winters, not Wyoming wind. It already felt inadequate. She had 43 cents in the pocket of her skirt. She'd counted it twice that morning in the gray light before the wagon rolled out of Cheyenne. 43 cents, a leather satchel that had belonged to her father, and a letter from a man named Gerald Hatch, the Blackthorn Ranch foreman, confirming employment, household management, and business correspondence. That was what the advertisement had said. That was what the letter confirmed. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Her father had died of a lung sickness in June. The print shop he'd spent 20 years building had gone to his creditors 3 weeks later. Her mother had been dead since Evelyn was 9, and she had no siblings, no aunts or uncles who'd take her in without making her feel like a charity case with an expiration date. The family she'd boarded with for 2 months after the shop closed had been kind, genuinely kind, but she'd seen the way they looked at each other across the dinner table when they thought she wasn't watching. The look that meant, how much longer? She'd found the advertisement in a newspaper she'd picked up off a train station bench. Blackthorn, Wyoming Territory. Seeking capable woman for household management and business records. Respectable employment. Write to Gerald Hatch, foreman. She'd written that same afternoon. The wagon rounded a low rise and Blackthorn Ranch came into view, and whatever romantic notion she'd been quietly nursing on the long journey from Boston quietly died. It was big. She'd give it that. The main house was 2 stories, wood frame, with a wide porch that had clearly been repaired in sections over the years. You could see where newer boards met old ones, the colors slightly different. There were 3 outbuildings she could identify from the road, plus what looked like a bunkhouse set back from the main structure, and beyond that a series of corrals where horses moved in lazy circles. A windmill turned slowly against the gray sky. Smoke came from the main house chimney, and from a smaller building she guessed was the cookhouse. The ranch hands she could see were watching the wagon approach. Not waving, just watching. Well, Gerald Hatch was a short, thick-necked man in his mid-40s with a red face that suggested either too much sun or too much whiskey, possibly both. He was standing in the yard when the wagon stopped, and he had the unhurried posture of a man who believed his time was worth more than everyone else's. He looked at Evelyn the way she'd been afraid he would, the way men looked at women who arrived somewhere alone with no husband in sight and not enough money to command respect. "You're the woman from Boston," he said. "Evelyn Hartwell." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help and extended her hand. He shook it, briefly, like the gesture confused him. "You're younger than I figured." "I'm 24. He looked her over once more, and she felt the categorizing happening behind his eyes. Not seeing her exactly, just sorting her into a box he already had prepared. "Letter said you had bookkeeping experience. I kept the accounts for my father's print shop for 6 years. And I managed correspondence, and ranch work's different from a print shop. He cut her off without raising his voice. We've got a situation here. Woman who was running the household, Mrs. Danforth, took ill 2 weeks ago. Had to send her back to her sisters in Colorado. So right now we're short-handed in ways that ain't about bookkeeping. She kept her voice steady. The advertisement specified household management and business correspondence. That's what I came for. And that work will come. Eventually. He said the word like it meant never. Right now what I need is someone who can haul water to the cookhouse in the mornings, help with laundry twice a week, and take a shift mucking the near stalls when the hands are short. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. That's not what I was hired for, she said. That's what the job is right now. His tone didn't change. It was the tone of a man who'd delivered this kind of news to women before and watched them accept it. You'll get your board and $3 a week, same as the letter said. The letter said $6. Something shifted in his face, not guilt exactly, more like mild irritation at being precise. $6 was for the full management position. Right now I'm offering modified duties until we assess whether you're suited. I'm suited for the work I was hired to do. Her heart was beating hard, but she kept her hands still at her sides. I rode 3 days to get here, Mr. Hatch. I gave up my place in Boston. I came because the work is what it is. He said it flatly, final. You want the bunk, or you want the wagon back to Cheyenne? Up to you. She took the bunk. She hated herself for it, the way you hate yourself for the things you have no real choice about. Her room, if you could call it that, was a small space partitioned off from a back storage room in the main house, just big enough for a narrow cot, a wall peg, and a washstand with a cracked basin. There was a window the size of a book that looked out onto the side yard. She could hear the wind through gaps in the siding. She sat on the cot for exactly 5 minutes, which was as long as she allowed herself to feel sorry for her situation. Then she unpacked her satchel, carefully, methodically, because keeping her things organized was the one small piece of control she had. And she went to find the cookhouse. The cook was a Mexican woman named Dolores, who was maybe 50 years old and had the efficient, unsentimental energy of someone who'd been doing hard work for decades and had stopped expecting it to get easier. She looked at Evelyn without any particular warmth, but without hostility either. You the new one? She said. I'm Evelyn. Dolores. She handed her a tin cup of coffee without being asked. Hatch tell you about the water hauling? He did. You lift before? I'll manage. Dolores made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. That's what the last one said. The ranch hands at the long table in the cookhouse watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. There were 8 of them at supper that first night, and none of them introduced themselves. A couple nodded. One, a young man with a sunburned neck and an expression that hadn't decided yet whether it was hostile or just wary, stared at her openly until the man beside him said something under his breath, and he looked away. She ate her beans and bread and didn't speak unless spoken to, which no one did. She listened instead because listening was something she was good at, and because information was the only currency she had any access to right now. She learned that the ranch was currently running about 300 head of cattle and had recently taken on additional grazing land to the north. She learned that the owner, a man named Robert Mercer, was in poor health and mostly confined to the main house. She learned that his son, Colton, had been running the day-to-day operations for the past year, which apparently hadn't gone over well with all of the hands, though no one said exactly why. She filed all of it away. The first morning was as bad as she'd expected. The water barrels were heavy. Not just heavy, the kind of heavy that argues with you, shifts on you, makes you recalculate your grip every few steps. She hauled them from the well to the cookhouse in the gray pre-dawn cold, while her Boston coat failed her completely, and her hands, which had spent 6 years managing paper and ink, screamed their objections. She made 4 trips. The 5th barrel she stopped halfway, set it down in the dirt, pressed her back against the fence post, and breathed through her nose until the burning in her arms subsided. Then she picked it up and finished. A ranch hand named Pete Dawes watched the whole thing from across the yard with his arms folded. When she passed him on the way back to the well, he said, "You sure you're up for this, miss?" "I'm standing, aren't I?" she said, and kept walking. She heard him laugh. Not meanly, exactly, more like she'd surprised him. The laundry was worse. Boiling water, heavy linens, the wooden paddles that blistered even calloused hands. By midday, her back was a single line of fire from her neck to her hips. She worked beside a girl named Clara, 17 years old, and the daughter of one of the permanent ranch hands, who had the easy physicality of someone who'd done this labor her whole life and couldn't quite understand why anyone would find it difficult. "You from back east?" Clara asked, wringing a sheet with practiced efficiency. "Boston." "Is it true they have streets made of brick?" "Some of them, yes." Clara absorbed this. "What made you come all the way out here?" Evelyn thought about how to answer that honestly without making it sound like a tragedy. "Needed work," she said finally, "and I wanted something different from what I had." It wasn't entirely a lie. She'd been at Blackthorn 4 days. 4 days of water hauling, laundry, and beginning to learn the names of the horses she was apparently also going to be expected to care for when she first properly met Colton Mercer. She'd seen him from a distance. Tall, lean, dark-haired, always moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had 17 things to do and 14 hours to do them in. She'd noticed he spoke to the hands differently than Hatch did, less like he was issuing orders, more like he was working through problems with people he trusted. Some of them responded to it. Others, she noticed, had a particular look when his back was turned. Not exactly disrespect, more like they hadn't decided yet whether he'd earned the authority he'd inherited. She met him properly on the 4th morning, which was also the morning she finally lost her temper. She'd arrived at the barn to begin the stall mucking, a task she'd added to her unofficial list without being asked, because she could see it needed doing, and because she was trying to make herself indispensable before she made any demands, and found that Pete Dawes had already distributed the tools among the hands, leaving her nothing to work with. "Where are the extra shovels?" she asked. "Tool shed's locked," Pete said, not unkindly. "Hatch has the key." "Then I'll get the key from Hatch." "Hatch left early, won't be back till noon." She stood there for a moment. "So I'm supposed to do nothing for 3 hours because you could help in the cookhouse." This from the young man with the sunburned neck, whose name she'd learned was Roy. He wasn't being cruel, just helpful in the way that assumed the cookhouse was obviously where she should be. "I'm assigned to the barn this morning," she said. "Assigned by who?" Roy said. "Hatch said the barn hands would cover." "I assigned myself," she said, "because someone needs to do it, and I'm the only one standing here with nothing in my hands." The brief silence that followed was broken by a voice from the barn entrance. "She's got a point." They all looked. Colton Mercer was standing in the doorway with a saddle over one arm and a bridle in his other hand, watching them with an expression that was somewhere between amused and assessing. He was older looking up close than from a distance, maybe 30, 32, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something more interesting than purely handsome. "Roy," he said, "there are 2 extra shovels in the tack room, right side, behind the saddle racks. Go get them." Roy went. Colton Mercer walked into the barn and set his saddle on a rack with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He didn't look at her directly while he did it. When he did turn, it was unhurried. "You're the woman Hatch hired from Boston." Evelyn Hartwell. Colton Mercer. He didn't extend his hand, but the way he said his own name wasn't proud, just matter of fact. "I know what you were hired to do and what Hatch has you doing instead. I want you to know those aren't the same thing." She studied him for a moment. "I know they're not. I've been meaning to look into the account books. My father's been asking for an audit of the cattle records for 2 months and no one's gotten to it." He paused. "You said you had bookkeeping experience. 6 years. And I can read and write well enough to handle correspondence if that's needed." "Both are needed." He looked at her levelly. "I can't pull you from Hatch's rotation without a conversation, and that conversation hasn't happened yet, but it'll happen today." She'd learned enough to not assume promises meant much out here. "What do I do in the meantime?" He glanced toward Roy, who was returning with 2 shovels. "Muck the stalls you were going to muck. It still needs doing." A hint of something. Not quite a smile, but close. "And I'll try to make it the last time." The conversation between Colton and Hatch happened that afternoon, and she knew it had happened because of the way Hatch looked at her at supper. Not angry, exactly, but recalculated. Like he'd put her in one box and she'd been moved to another, and he wasn't sure yet what that meant for him. He came to her after supper, while she was washing up at the basin in the back room. "Mercer wants you in the office tomorrow morning," he said. His voice was neutral. Professional, even. 7 o'clock. He'll show you the ledgers." "All right." He stood there a moment, She waited. You got what you wanted, he said finally. I got what I was hired for, she said. There's a difference. He left without responding. The office was a room off the main hallway of the house. Not large, but orderly in a way that suggested someone cared about it. A wide desk, 2 filing cabinets, shelves of ledger books organized by year, a window that looked out toward the north pasture. There was a faded map of the Sweetwater County land claims pinned to the wall, annotated in at least 3 different handwriting styles. Colton was already there when she arrived. He had coffee, 2 cups, she noticed, which meant he'd expected her to be on time. Sit, he said, and pushed one of the cups across the desk. She sat. She picked up the cup. The coffee was strong and not particularly good, but it was warm and she was cold, and she didn't say anything about it. The ranch runs 312 head right now, he said. My father built this operation over 25 years. We own about 6,000 acres outright, lease another 2,000 to the north. The books for the cattle operations go back 8 years. The household accounts are kept separately. He paused. The problem is, there are numbers that don't line up. What kind of numbers? He opened the top ledger and turned it toward her. Supply purchases. Every quarter, there are line items for materials that I can't match to actual deliveries. Tools, feed, fencing supplies. Small amounts. $20 here, $30 there. But it's been going on for 2 years, and it adds up. She pulled the ledger closer and began to read. She could feel him watching her and ignored it in the way she'd learned to ignore being watched by people who were trying to figure out what she was. Do you have the receipts? She asked. Some of them. And the delivery logs? In the second cabinet. She looked up. How long do you need this done by? How long do you need? If I can work without interruption, and if the records are reasonably organized, I can give you a preliminary accounting in 4 days, a full reconciliation in 2 weeks. He studied her. You've done this kind of work before. I told you I had. You told me bookkeeping. This is more like... He thought about it. Investigation. Bookkeeping is investigation, she said. Numbers tell you what happened. You just have to know how to read them. Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly. More like he'd been expecting competence and was mildly pleased to find it where he'd looked. 4 days for the preliminary, he said. Then we'll talk. She spent 3 days in that office, and they were the best 3 days she'd had in months. This was the work she understood, not the water hauling, not the laundry. This. The logic of numbers. The way a ledger told a story if you were patient enough to listen. She could lose herself in it in the way she hadn't been able to lose herself in anything since her father got sick. That clean, absorbed state where the outside world receded and there was only the problem in front of her. The discrepancies were real. She found them, traced them, cross-referenced them against delivery records, and found the gaps. Supplies ordered, paid for, never received. Or received in smaller quantities than billed. The amounts were modest enough that no single line item would flag itself. That was the cleverness of it. But the pattern was clear once you laid 3 years of records out and looked at them together. Clara brought her meals on a tray the first day, which embarrassed her, but she didn't refuse because she didn't want to lose the momentum of what she was finding. On the second evening, Colton came in after supper and stood in the doorway and looked at the spread of papers across the desk. You're still at it, he said. I thought I'd finished the supply records tonight. She looked up. She'd been at it for 12 hours and was aware she probably looked like it. I found the pattern. I need another day to document it properly. He came in and looked over her shoulder at the papers. She was acutely aware of his proximity. Not in a distressing way, more in the way you become aware of weather when you step outside. He smelled like horse and clean sweat, and something else she couldn't name. Who? He said quietly. I don't know yet. She tapped a column. The payments go to 2 suppliers, Morley Dry Goods and a company called Western Supply Partners. I need to know who Western Supply Partners actually is. If it's a real business, these could be legitimate mistakes. And if it's not a real business? She met his eyes briefly. Then someone's been stealing from your father for 2 years. I was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. What it meant, what it required. Document what you have, he said. All of it, exactly as you find it. That's what I'm doing. He nodded. He started to leave, then stopped in the doorway. I want you to know, he said, not looking back at her, that I appreciate the care you're taking. Most people... He paused, edited something. Most people would have handed me a number and called it done. I'm not most people, she said. No, he agreed. I don't think you are. She presented her findings to him on the fourth morning with a handwritten report she'd stayed up until midnight finishing. 14 pages, methodical, sourced, annotated with the specific ledger references for every discrepancy she'd identified. He read it at the desk while she stood by the window and watched the north pasture. The horses moved slowly in the cold morning light. She could hear the scratch of his fingers turning pages. When he finished, he was silent for a moment. $260 over 2 years, he said. 263. And some change. Western Supply Partners. He said it carefully, like he was testing its weight. I need to find out who owns this company. The county clerk's office in Cheyenne would have business registration records, if it was registered in Wyoming territory. And if it wasn't, then it probably doesn't exist. He set the report down and looked at her. It was the most direct he'd looked at her yet. Not the assessing look of those first days, but something else, something that had moved past evaluation into something less easy to categorize. I'm going to need you to keep this between us, he said, until I know who's involved. Of course. I mean it. Not the hands. Not... He stopped. Started again. There are people on this ranch who have been here longer than I've been running it. People who have loyalties that are complicated. I understand. She paused. I haven't told anyone anything. I haven't spoken about the ledgers at all. I know. He said it simply, not as a compliment, but as a fact. I've been paying attention. She noticed that and filed it away with everything else she'd been filing away. The question of Hatch announced itself 3 days later, and not in a way she'd anticipated. She was in the office. She'd been given more or less permanent access to it now, which had caused a noticeable shift in how the hands looked at her, not all of it comfortable. When she heard raised voices from the hallway, not loud enough to make out words, just the tenor of a disagreement that had moved past the polite stage. She kept working. It wasn't her business. 2 minutes later, the door opened and Colton came in, and he had the tight, controlled expression of a man who was actively managing his own anger. He sat down at the edge of the desk and said nothing for a moment. Gerald Hatch has been the foreman of this ranch for 9 years, he said finally. My father trusts him completely. I see. She kept her voice neutral. He came to me this morning with concerns about your presence in the office, about the work you've been doing. What kind of concerns? The kind where he suggested that women reviewing financial records creates unnecessary disruption. He said it flatly, without inflection, which was somehow more telling than anger would have been. And that he has questions about your purpose here. She set her pen down. Does he know what I found? No, I haven't told him. He looked at her directly. But he knows something is going on. He's not stupid. What are you going to do? I was quiet for a moment. She could see him genuinely working through it, not performing deliberation, actually doing it, which she respected. I'm going to protect this investigation, he said, and I'm going to send a letter to the clerk's office in Cheyenne today asking about Western Supply Partners. He paused. And I'm going to make it clear to Gerald that your position here is at my direction, not up for discussion. He won't like that. No. A brief, humorless flicker. He won't. She picked up her pen again. Then we'd better make sure the documentation is thorough enough to speak for itself. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. We should. The letter from Cheyenne came back in 11 days. Western Supply Partners had been registered in Wyoming territory in March of 1874. The registered owner was a man named Thomas Greer. Thomas Greer was Gerald Hatch's brother-in-law. Colton came to her with the letter. He stood in the office doorway and read her the relevant section without preamble, his voice steady and careful. When he finished, she waited. I have to tell my father, he said. Yes. He's going to... He stopped. Started differently. This is going to hurt him. Gerald's been with this ranch since before I was grown. My father considers him... He shook his head. This is going to hurt. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Not sorry she'd found it. She'd had to find it. She'd been right to find it. But sorry for the particular pain that comes from being betrayed by someone you trusted completely, which was a pain she knew something about. He looked up at her. You've done nothing wrong. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. I know. I wanted to make sure you knew that I know. He said it like it mattered to him that she understand the distinction. Whatever happens next, with Hatch, with my father, with the ranch, you did the work right. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't have moved her as much as it did. She'd spent months being invisible, being told she was useful only for labor that anyone could do, being looked through by men who'd already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. To be seen clearly, even in just this one thing, felt like water after a long dry stretch. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Then he went to have the conversation with his father, and she sat at the desk and stared at the north pasture through the window for a long time, thinking about things she wasn't ready to name yet. Robert Mercer was a tall man who had once been broader. The illness had been taking weight from him for 2 years, and it showed in the way his clothes hung and in the gaunt set of his face. But there was still something substantial about him, the bearing of a man who'd built something large from nothing and knew it. Colton brought her to meet him the evening after the letter arrived. She hadn't asked to come. He'd asked her to accompany him, and she'd understood that he wanted her there as a witness, possibly as a kind of anchor. Robert Mercer sat in a high-backed chair by the fireplace in the main room. He looked at Evelyn with sharp, tired eyes. "My son tells me you're the one who found this," he said. No preamble. "I found the discrepancies in the records, yes, sir. Gerald Hatch has worked this land for 9 years. He said it heavily, not accusingly, just heavily, like something he was having trouble setting down. I know. She held his gaze. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pressed against the house with its usual indifference. Colton says you're the best person he's had in that office in 5 years, Robert Mercer said finally. That's counting 2 men and a woman who grew up on a ranch. She didn't know what to say to that. Don't go humble on me, he said dryly. It doesn't suit you from what I hear. Something loosened in her chest, not comfort exactly, but the particular relief of being recognized accurately. No, sir, she said. It doesn't. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then he looked at his son with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between pride and regret, and things too personal for a stranger to name. Handle it, he said to Colton. You know what needs doing. Yes, sir. He looked at Evelyn once more. You'll stay on. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. I'll stay. Gerald Hatch left Blackthorn Ranch on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before the first hard frost of the season. Colton had the conversation with him in private. She never knew what was said. Hatch was gone by midday, riding out with his personal effects on a single horse, and the ranch hands watched him go with varied expressions and the general silence of people who were waiting to see what came next. What came next was a restructuring. A new foreman, a quiet, methodical man named Sam Aldridge, who'd been the head wrangler for 3 years, was moved into the role. Supply orders were reorganized. Evelyn formally took over the household accounts and the cattle business records under her original title, Ranch Administrator. It wasn't a title anyone on the frontier had much experience with when it applied to a woman. She was aware of that. She was aware of the looks, the pauses, the handful of hands who found reasons to be somewhere else whenever she walked through the cookhouse. She didn't fight it. She just worked, methodically, thoroughly, every day, and slowly, not quickly, not smoothly, with setbacks and resistances, and days when she ate supper alone because the tension in the cookhouse was too thick to be comfortable. The ranch began to function around her presence rather than in spite of it. She was at her desk on a cold October evening, working through the feed order for the coming winter, when she heard a knock at the open office door. She looked up. Colton Mercer stood there. He had his hat in his hands and the look of a man who'd come to say something he'd been organizing for a while. You should know, he said, that my father asked me this morning whether I thought you'd be willing to take on the spring cattle count as well, the full inventory and valuation. What did you tell him? I told him I thought you probably would. A slight pause. Was I right? She looked at him, this man who'd given her a tool and space and the rare decency of trusting her to use them. Yes, she said. You were right. He nodded. He started to leave. Colton. She said his first name because it was accurate and because she'd been calling him Mr. Mercer for 6 weeks, and it had begun to feel wrong in a way she couldn't fully explain. He turned back. Thank you. For what you did with Hatch. For all of it. I was quiet for a moment and she could see him deciding something. Don't thank me for that, he said. You earned every bit of it yourself. He put his hat back on and walked down the hallway, and she sat for a moment in the lamplight with the winter feed numbers in front of her, listening to the wind work at the eaves of the house, and thought, with a carefulness that was almost deliberate caution, that this was what it felt like to be somewhere she'd chosen to be. It was strange. It was new. She picked up her pen and got back to work. The first hard frost came overnight, without warning, the way winter always announced itself in Wyoming. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a door slamming shut. Evelyn woke to ice on the inside of her small window and the sound of the ranch hands moving earlier than usual, their boots on frozen ground carrying further in the cold air than they did in the warmth of autumn. She dressed quickly, pulled on her coat. She'd bought a proper one in late October, heavy wool lined with flannel, from a dry goods store in the nearest town, and went to the office before breakfast. There was a list she'd been building for 2 weeks, a winter supply inventory cross-referenced against what they had on hand, and she wanted to finish it before Colton needed it. He'd mentioned needing the numbers by Friday. It was Thursday. That was how most of her days had structured themselves since October, by what needed doing next, by the list, by the ledger. It was a rhythm she'd learned to rely on, not because it was comfortable, but because it kept her from thinking too much about the other things. The loneliness, for instance. The particular ache of being respected by people who still wouldn't quite call you a friend. The way Sunday evenings stretched on with nothing to fill them except the wind and the distant sound of the hands playing cards in the bunkhouse. She didn't complain about any of it. Complaining required an audience willing to listen, and she hadn't built that yet. What she had built was a working order. The accounts were clean, properly organized for the first time in what she estimated was 3 years. The supply chain was documented. The cattle records were up to date. She'd started a correspondence log, every letter sent and received by the ranch, organized by date and subject. Because the previous system, which was essentially a pile of paper in a wooden crate, had already cost the ranch one missed debt payment and nearly cost them a grazing lease. Sam Aldridge, the new foreman, had taken to coming to her with questions. Not often, and never about anything that could be read as an admission that a woman might know something he didn't, but regularly enough to mean something. He'd stop at the office door in the evenings with a specific question. What did we pay for that load of fence posts last spring? Or is there a contract on record for the Hendricks grazing arrangement? And she'd find the answer, and he'd nod and leave, and the next time he stopped by, he'd bring her coffee without commenting on it. It wasn't friendship, but it was something. The harder relationship was with the hands who hadn't adjusted. There were 3 in particular. Roy, a man named Burkett, who'd been at the ranch for 7 years, and an older hand called Lester, whose silence had a weight to it that was different from reserve. They weren't openly hostile. They were worse than that. They were consistently, methodically dismissive, in the small ways that are harder to address than open confrontation. Questions directed past her to Aldridge, even when she was the one who held the relevant records. Conversations that stopped when she walked in and resumed when she left. The specific blankness men wear when they've decided a person doesn't warrant acknowledgement. She kept working. It was all she knew how to do. Colton noticed because he noticed most things about the ranch. He came to her one afternoon in early November, closed the office door, which he rarely did, and sat down across the desk from her. Burkett asked me yesterday why we're paying a woman to do work that could be done by a man, he said, without preamble. She looked up from the ledger. What did you tell him? I told him we're paying you to do work that wasn't being done by anyone. He said it evenly, without drama. And that if he had a specific professional complaint about the quality of the work, I'd hear it. Otherwise, the conversation was over. She was quiet for a moment. Did he have a specific complaint? No? Then that was the right answer. She paused. I appreciate you telling me. I told you because you should know where things stand, not to reassure you. He leaned back slightly. You don't seem like someone who needs reassuring. Everyone needs it sometimes. He considered that, and she saw something move in his expression that she'd been noticing more often lately. A kind of careful attention, like he was recording things. Like her words went somewhere specific in him rather than just washing past. How are you finding the winter? He asked. It was a different kind of question than he usually asked her. Personal, almost. She set her pen down. Cold, she said. Different from Boston? Boston is cold. This is... She thought about how to say it. Boston cold is an inconvenience. This is something you negotiate with. He looked like he almost smiled. That's a good way to put it. I've been thinking about the spring cattle count, she said, because she was uncertain what to do with the softness of this conversation and defaulted to work. If we standardize the notation system this winter, the count itself will go faster. I've been looking at the old records, and every year they use a different system, which makes year-over-year comparison. Evelyn. He said her name with a quiet firmness, not unkind. She stopped. The count can wait until after supper. She looked at him. He looked back. The fire in the office stove popped once. All right, she said. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her. She'd expected to fill it, to default to something useful. She didn't. He didn't. The wind pressed against the window and the lamp threw its small circle of warmth, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, and it was strange. Not bad strange. The other kind. Then he stood and put on his hat and said he'd see her at supper, and left. She sat for a moment after the door closed and did what she always did when something happened she wasn't ready to examine. She picked up her pen and went back to work. The drought started as a rumor in November and became a fact by December. It hadn't snowed enough. The hands all said it, with the resigned certainty of people who'd watched enough winters to read the signs. The snowpack in the hills was thin. The creek levels were already lower than they should be for the season. Without a wet winter, spring would be lean, and a lean spring meant a brutal summer for the cattle. Colton rode out with Aldridge most mornings to assess the grazing land, and she could track the news in his face when he came back. Not dramatics. He wasn't a man who wore his worry loudly, but a tightening around his eyes, a particular set to his jaw that she'd learned to read like another kind of ledger. The conversations at supper grew more practical and more grim in equal measure. Water rights came up repeatedly. Which neighbors held them? Which were disputed? Whether the northern creek could be relied on if the southern one ran low. There was a rancher named Pierce Whitmore who held a water rights claim upstream that the Mercers had been in quiet disagreement with for years. Now quiet was becoming less practical. Whitmore's been diverting from the upper creek, Aldridge said one evening, not quite under his breath. Not legally, just gradually. Gradually is how people steal things they can't take outright, Evelyn said. Several heads turned. She was aware she'd said it more directly than was diplomatic for the supper table. Colton looked at her from the far end. You know water law? I know theft, she said. The legal question is whether the diversion violates the original claim. What does your father's original deed say about the creek? I'd have to look. I can look, she said. Do you have the original land documents? Hung did. They spent 2 evenings going through them together. The original land grant, the water rights documentation, the various amendments and neighbor agreements that had accumulated over 20 years of a ranch's life. It was detailed, painstaking work, and Colton sat across from her at the desk and read when she handed him documents and asked her questions that were specific and useful. She found what they needed on the second evening. A clause in the original creek use agreement, signed by both parties in 1859, that specified flow minimums and prohibited upstream diversion during drought conditions. It had been largely forgotten. The relevant document was buried in a folder marked Correspondence 1858 to 1861 that had apparently not been opened in a decade. There it is, she said, and pushed it across the desk. He read it again, looked up at her. Whitmore's lawyers are going to say this is outdated. Lawyers say what they're paid to say. What does the document say? He almost smiled. You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd have made a terrible lawyer. I don't have the patience for arguments I know are wrong. She tapped the document. Make a copy of this. 2 copies. Send one to your father's attorney in Cheyenne tonight if you can. He nodded, and she saw the relief in it. Not relief that the problem was solved, because it wasn't, but the particular relief of having something solid to hold against uncertainty, of knowing where you stood. Thank you, he said. It was in a folder. Lots of things are in folders, he said. Most people don't find them. She wrote the letter to the Cheyenne attorney herself, because Colton asked her to. It was the first formal legal correspondence she'd drafted on behalf of the ranch, and she took care with it. Precise language, specific references, no emotional inflation, just the facts as clearly as she could arrange them. He read it over when she finished and handed it back without changes. You wrote exactly what needed to be said, he told her. That's what good correspondence does. Where'd you learn to write like that? My father. She paused. The words still landed differently than it used to, with a weight she had to brace slightly against. He ran a print shop. He believed that how you put words together says as much about your thinking as the words themselves. She looked down at the letter. He made me rewrite every piece of correspondence I drafted until it said exactly what I meant and nothing else. He sounds like a precise man. I was. She folded the letter. He was also occasionally wrong about things and stubborn about it, and he told the same 3 stories so many times I could recite them before he got to the end. She looked up. But mostly he was good. Colton was quiet for a moment. When did he die? June. She said it without softening it, because softening it didn't help. Lung sickness. It took about 8 months from when we knew. I'm sorry. I was the kind of person who would have found Wyoming interesting, she said. He liked things that were complicated. She handed him the letter. That's the attorney copy. I have a second for our records. He took it. He held it for a moment without moving toward the door. My mother died when I was 12, he said. She hadn't asked. He offered it, and she understood it as what it was. The giving of a thing to balance the receiving of one. She was the one who kept the household accounts before that. My father never really... He stopped. He's a good man. Business is something he understands. The paper side of things is not. That's not uncommon. No. He looked at the letter in his hand. She would have liked you, I think. It was an honest thing to say, and caught her slightly off guard by its honesty. She didn't know what to do with it. I'll take that as a compliment, she said. It is one. He left, and she filed the second copy of the letter in the correspondence log, and she did not think about what he'd said for the rest of the evening. Or she tried not to. She was less successful than she would have liked. Winter bore down in January with the particular cruelty of a season that had been mild enough to encourage hope and then decided to punish it. 3 weeks of cold that was not quite cold enough to build the snowpack they needed, followed by 2 weeks of a dry, cutting wind that sucked moisture from the ground and left the grass in the north pastures brittle and pale. The cattle were restless. 2 horses came up lame in the same week, which Aldridge said was the cold, but which felt like an omen to the hands, who were starting to have the drawn look of people waiting for the next bad thing. And then the cookhouse roof partially collapsed under ice weight on a Tuesday morning, while Dolores was thankfully not inside it, and everything stopped being theoretical. Evelyn heard the sound from the office, a deep, tearing crack followed by a crash, and was out the door before she'd consciously decided to move. She reached the cookhouse a few steps behind 2 ranch hands and found Dolores standing in the yard, looking at the wreckage with the composure of a woman who had been through worse. I was outside getting wood, Dolores said, to no one in particular. The collapse had taken out the northeast corner of the building, including the section with the main stove. The beams were salvageable, but the roof structure was gone over roughly a third of the space, and with temperatures below freezing, it couldn't wait. Colton was there within minutes. He stood at the edge of the damage and looked at it with that measuring quality he had, cataloging, calculating, while around him the hands argued about whether it was faster to bring in a carpenter from town or do it themselves. I'll start on the repair list, Evelyn said to him, quietly, because she could see he was thinking. He looked at her. Do that, and figure out where we're feeding people in the meantime. The main house had a kitchen used only by the household, herself, the Mercer family, when Robert was well enough, occasional guests. She walked back to it, looked at the size of the stove, the workspace, the larder. Dolores, she called back to the yard, come look at this with me. Dolores came. They stood in the household kitchen together, and Dolores turned slowly and assessed it with the professional skepticism of a cook who is being offered something inadequate and knows it. It's tight, Dolores said. I know. I can feed maybe 12 people at a time from this, not 20. We'll do 2 sittings. That's twice as much work. Yes. Evelyn paused. I'll help. Dolores looked at her, not unkindly, but with the frank directness of someone who'd watched this woman haul water in a Boston coat and wasn't about to pretend that had gone well. You cook? I can chop, and I can carry things. Dolores made the same sound she'd made on Evelyn's first day. Not quite a laugh. All right. She turned back to the household kitchen and began moving things around with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who'd decided something and was acting on it. 2 sittings. Hands first, then the house. I'll tell Colton. You do that. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. Evelyn made her way back through the cold to where Colton stood reviewing the repair with Aldridge, and she reported the plan, and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting. And when she finished, he said, "Good thinking. That should have been enough." It was enough. And yet she found, walking back to the main house with her list of what needed ordering and who needed contacting, that the simple phrase had settled somewhere warm in her chest and stayed there. And she thought, with the same cautious deliberateness she'd been applying to a number of things lately, that she was in considerably more trouble than she'd originally anticipated. The cookhouse repair took 3 weeks, which was 1 week longer than Colton had estimated, and 3 days longer than the carpenter he'd brought from town had promised. By the end of it, Evelyn had spent more time in the household kitchen than in the office, which had reorganized a number of things she'd taken for granted. She ate with Dolores most evenings, after the 2 sittings were done and the kitchen was cleaned. Dolores was not a talkative woman, but she was a consistent one, and consistency was something Evelyn had been starved of without knowing it. "You're not what I expected," Dolores told her one evening over the last of the coffee. "What did you expect? Someone who'd leave by Christmas." She said it plainly, without apology. "Women from back east, they come out sometimes. Think the frontier is a different kind of life. And it is. But it's not the kind they were thinking of." She shrugged. "Most go home. I don't have a home to go back to." "That's not why you stayed, though." Evelyn looked at her. "No," she said, "it's not." Dolores nodded once, like this confirmed something. She didn't press it. That was the thing about her. She asked the question that mattered, and then let you alone with the answer, which was more respectful than most people managed. The truth was that Evelyn had stopped thinking of leaving sometime in November, and hadn't fully noticed until now. Not because the work was easy, it wasn't, and not because she'd stopped noticing the loneliness or the cold, or the men who still looked past her when she walked into a room. She'd stayed because something had shifted from endurance to ownership. This was her work now. These were her records, her correspondence, her carefully built systems. She'd made something here that hadn't existed before she arrived, and the making of it had changed her in ways she was still mapping. She was willing to admit to herself in the private dark of her small room, developed a specific problem with a specific person, and that problem was growing in the way that quiet problems do. Slowly, steadily, until the day you notice it's no longer small. The moment it became undeniable was unremarkable, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. It was a February evening, cold and still, and she was in the office working late on the spring preparation numbers when Colton knocked and came in and found her asleep at the desk. Genuinely asleep, forehead on her folded arms, pen still in her hand. She woke to the sound of him setting something on the corner of the desk and straightened up immediately, which was mortifying. "I wasn't," she started. "You were." "I was resting my eyes." "Your eyes were asleep." He set the cup of coffee in front of her. "So was the rest of you." He sat down across from her, and in the lamplight she could see he was tired too. The particular tiredness of someone who'd been outside in the cold all day and hadn't yet shed it. "How long have you been at this?" She looked at the papers. "What time is it?" "Almost 9. She had no response to that. "Evelyn." He said her name with a patience that had no edge to it. "The numbers will still be wrong tomorrow, if you look at them then. You don't fix them by staying awake until you can't see straight." "I know." "Do you?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that careful attention of his, the recording look. And she was tired enough to say something honest. "I like the work," she said. "I know that sounds... It's not that I don't know when to stop. It's that stopping is harder than continuing, and continuing at least feels like something." He was quiet for a moment. "What does stopping feel like?" She picked up the coffee cup. The warmth of it was nearly painful in her cold hands. "Like there's nothing between me and whatever I'm not thinking about." She heard that land, and wished briefly that she'd been less honest. "What are you not thinking about?" he asked. "Things that don't make practical sense," she said, which was true and also nothing, and she could see he knew that, and he let her have it anyway. "Drink the coffee," he said, then go to bed. The spring numbers will be there in the morning." "You brought me coffee," she said. Not an accusation, just noting it. "Dolores told me you'd been in here since 3. "You could have sent anyone." "I could have," he agreed, and he didn't look away when he said it, and she thought, carefully, with full awareness of how carefully she needed to think about this, that they had arrived somewhere neither of them had explicitly agreed to travel toward, and that she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. She drank the coffee. He stayed until she had, and then they walked out of the office together in the quiet of the house, and at the hallway where their paths divided. She said goodnight, and he said goodnight. And she went to her room and lay on the narrow cot in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about impractical things for a very long time before she finally slept. Spring arrived reluctantly, the way it does in Wyoming, grudgingly, by degrees, the cold not surrendering so much as retreating. The drought had indeed been real, the southern creek was running low, and the grass on the south pastures was coming in thinner than it should. Pierce Whitmore had backed down from the upstream diversion after receiving the letter from the Cheyenne attorney, which was a victory, though it hadn't solved the underlying water question. It had merely postponed it. The cattle count consumed the first 2 weeks of April. Evelyn ran it, which was still, she was aware, a thing that required some of the hands to arrange their expressions carefully before responding to her instructions. She ran it by being specific and impersonal and right when it mattered, and by the end of the second week the numbers were documented and verified, and she had a full inventory and valuation report on Colton's desk before he'd expected it. He came to find her when he'd read it. "There's a problem," he said. "I know, the West Pasture count. We're short 40 head from last October." "Yes." She turned in her chair. "I've been going through the movement records. Either there's documentation that's missing, which is possible, the November transfer logs have 2 gaps, or we've had theft." She'd been careful not to say that word first. "It's possible. The gaps are in the right places to suggest it." He sat down heavily. "My father's not well enough for this conversation." "I know. If we've had someone taking cattle, we don't know that yet." She kept her voice steady. "Let me work through the November logs before we conclude anything. If the documentation gaps are real, there might be a legitimate explanation. Transfer to the Hendricks lease, maybe, that wasn't recorded properly." He looked at her. The tiredness in his face was the accumulated kind. Not one bad day, but many, stacked. "And if it's not a legitimate explanation, then we deal with it." She paused. "The same way we dealt with the last one." He held her gaze for a moment, and in it she saw something she recognized. The look of a person who was very tired and was choosing, actively, to trust someone. It was a look that asked something of the receiver, and she felt the weight of it. "All right," he said, "work through the logs." She was already reaching for the filing cabinet when he spoke again, quietly, from the doorway. "Evelyn." She looked up. "I don't know what this ranch would look like right now without you." She didn't have an answer for that. She thought about it, really thought about it, and found that on the other side of the honesty was something she wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet, something that felt large and fragile and terrifyingly real. "Go check on your cattle," she said. "I'll have the log review done by Friday." He left, and she pulled the November files, and she worked, and outside the spring wind moved through the new grass of the Wyoming pastures, and the ranch went on about its business, carrying all of them, all of their careful, unspoken things, along with it. The November logs took her 4 days, not 3, because the gaps weren't accidental. She found it on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of April, the kind of gray-skied day that couldn't decide between winter and spring and had settled on something worse than either. She'd been through every transfer record, every movement notation, every scrap of paper that touched the question of where 40 head of cattle had gone between October and the spring count. And there it was. Not a gap exactly, but a seam. 2 sets of handwriting in the same log, entries made on the same dates but clearly not by the same hand, the ink color slightly different if you held them side by side in the right light. Someone had added entries after the fact. She sat with that for a moment before she did anything else, because this was the part of the work she'd never fully gotten used to. The moment when numbers stopped being an abstract problem and became a person's deliberate choice. Someone had sat down with this log and written false entries and done it carefully enough to pass a casual inspection. That required time. That required access. That required a specific kind of cold nerve. She made a second copy of the relevant pages, locked the originals in the cabinet, and went to find Colton. He was in the north pasture with Aldridge, which meant a 20-minute walk in wind that had decided to be winter after all. She put on her coat and went. He saw her coming from a distance and separated from Aldridge without being asked, which she noticed and which meant he'd been waiting for this in the way you wait for bad news you've already half accepted. She handed him the copied pages when she reached him and let him read without talking. The wind pulled at the papers, and he held them down with both hands. When he looked up, his face was careful. Who has access to the logbooks? The foreman. You. In theory, any senior hand who needed to record a movement. She paused. But the original entries are in Aldridge's handwriting. The additions are someone else's. You're sure they're additions? Different ink, different pen pressure. The dates match, but the formation of the numerals is different in a specific way. The sevens have a crossbar in the additions. Aldridge doesn't cross his sevens. She paused. I checked. He was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, the cattle moved slowly across the dry grass, indifferent to everything. Roy, he said finally. Not a question. She said nothing. Roy has been with us 2 years, he said. He was recommended by Whitmore. That landed between them. She let it sit for a moment. I don't know who the additions belong to. I can tell you they're not Aldridge's. The rest, I'll handle it. He said it with a flatness that she recognized now. The specific flatness that meant he was angry and was keeping it out of his voice because letting it into his voice cost too much. Colton. She waited until he looked at her. Be sure before you do anything. If you're wrong, I've been watching Roy since February. He folded the papers with precise, controlled movements and tucked them inside his coat. I didn't want to be right. She understood that. The wanting to be wrong, she understood it completely. I'll document everything I have, she said. Every page, every comparison. If this goes anywhere legal, you'll need the paper record to be solid. He nodded. He looked out across the pasture for a moment, and she could see the particular exhaustion that came not from the physical work, but from the accumulation of betrayals. Hatch. Now this. His father's declining health threading through all of it like a low, constant note. I was 32 years old and running a 6,000-acre ranch and managing a dying man's legacy and dealing with people who stole from him, and none of it had made him hard in the way it made some men hard. It had made him careful. There was a difference. Go back to the office, he said. Get warm. I'll come by this evening. I'm fine. You walked 20 minutes in that wind without a hat. He said it the way you say something you've noticed before but not mentioned. Go back to the office. She went. Roy was gone by Saturday morning. She didn't know the details of the conversation and didn't ask. What she knew was that Friday evening, Colton had been in the main house with Aldridge for 2 hours with the door closed, and Saturday at breakfast. Roy's place at the table was empty, and when Clara asked where he was, Pete Dawes said he'd moved on, and that was the end of it. Burkett watched Evelyn across the table with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not grief exactly. Burkett and Roy hadn't been close, as far as she'd observed. Something more like recalculation, like he was revising something and hadn't finished. 2 days later, Burkett knocked on the office door. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, genuinely in his hands, not as a performance, because Burkett was not a performing kind of man. He looked uncomfortable in the way men look uncomfortable when they're doing something that costs them something. I wanted to say something, he said. All right, what you did. With the ledgers. Roy. He stopped, started differently. I've been at this ranch 7 years. I didn't see what he was doing. You'd been here 6 months. He turned his hat once in his hands. I misjudged you. I wanted to say so. She studied him for a moment. I was not a man who did this easily. She could see the effort in every word, the way he kept his eyes just slightly to the left of direct contact, like honesty was a sun he could only look near, not at. I appreciate that, she said. I wasn't kind to you when you got here. No? He nodded, like her directness confirmed something. I'm saying I was wrong. She thought about several responses and chose the one that was true. The work speaks for itself. That's all I ever wanted. He left, and she sat for a moment thinking about the particular satisfaction of a thing earned slowly and imperfectly, and decided it was worth considerably more than the easy kind. Spring moved into May, and with May came the first real warmth, and with the warmth came a different kind of tension on the ranch. The drought had done its damage. The southern pastures were still struggling, and the cattle required supplemental feed that was cutting into the season's margins. Colton had spent 3 weeks in a running negotiation with a neighboring rancher about access to water from a northern tributary, not Whitmore's land, different territory. And the negotiation was going badly in the polite, stalled way that meant the other party wanted something beyond the stated terms. She'd been helping him draft the correspondence for it, which meant she knew every turn of the negotiation and had opinions about all of it. She was careful about which opinions she voiced. Some of them she kept to herself until he asked. Some he asked before she'd decided whether to offer. "You think I'm being too patient with Connolly," he said one evening, going over the latest letter draft. "I think you're giving him room he isn't using productively. If I push harder, he'll pull back entirely. If you don't push harder, he'll take 3 more weeks to say no." She pointed to the second paragraph. "This line, we would welcome the opportunity for further discussion. That's an invitation for delay. He's already had 3 weeks. Colton looked at the line. "What would you write instead?" She picked up the pen and crossed the line out, wrote something above it, and pushed it back. He read it. "That's considerably more direct. It's accurate. You have a specific need, a specific offer, and a specific time frame. He knows all of this. Restating it without the softening language doesn't change your position. It just makes clear that the position is real." He looked at the revision for a long moment. Then, "Do I seem like someone who softens things too much?" It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. She could see that. "You're fair," she said carefully. "You explain your thinking. You give people room. Those are good qualities." She paused. "Sometimes people mistake room for weakness." He set the letter down. "Has anyone ever told you that you're unnervingly direct?" "Several times." "Did they mean it as a complaint?" "Usually." She looked at him. "Did you?" The question landed in the small space between them, and he looked at her for a moment with that attention of his, the full, specific, not looking away kind, and said, "No." The evening had gone quiet around them, the ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms outside the window. She was aware of the smallness of the office, the two of them in it, the lamp's limited reach. "Send the letter as I revised it," she said, and picked up her pen again. "See what he says?" Connolly agreed to terms 10 days later. It wasn't everything Colton had wanted, but it was enough. Enough water access to carry the herd through the summer if they managed the rotation carefully. He told her over supper, in front of the hands, and she noticed the looks that passed around the table. Not hostile anymore, mostly, just aware. Taking note. Clara caught her eye from across the table and smiled. It was Dolores who said it out loud first, which was both surprising and not at all. They were in the household kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in early June, Evelyn doing the correspondence she'd pushed back all week, Dolores making bread with the focused quiet of someone doing a thing they'd done 1,000 times. The house was mostly empty. The hands had a half day, Robert Mercer was resting, Colton had ridden out to the east fence line after the morning's work. "He watches you," Dolores said, not looking up from the dough. Evelyn didn't look up from her letter. "Most people watch the person they're talking to." "He watches you when you're not talking." Evelyn continued writing. The sentence she was in the middle of refused to finish itself properly. "Dolores, I'm not asking you anything." Dolores shaped the dough with efficient, unsentimental hands. "I'm just saying what I see." "What you see is a working relationship. What I see is a man who brought a woman coffee at 9 at night in February and then stood in her doorway for 40 minutes before he found a reason to leave." She paused. "I know because I was up with a sick stomach and I heard him." Evelyn set down her pen. "He's my employer," she said. "Robert Mercer is your employer. Colton is—" Dolores appeared to consider. "Something else." She picked her pen back up. "This is not a useful conversation." "Maybe not." Dolores covered the dough with a cloth. "But useful isn't the only kind." Evelyn stared at her letter. The sentence still wouldn't finish. The honest answer, the one she kept folded away in a place she didn't visit often, was that Dolores was right, and she knew it, and had known it for months. She'd known it the night he brought the coffee. She'd known it in the cold north pasture when he'd told her he hadn't wanted to be right about Roy. She'd known it in a dozen smaller moments that she'd been filing away under irrelevant and impractical and not the point, and the folder had gotten very full. The practical objections were real, and she held on to them deliberately. She was an employee. He was the man who would one day own this ranch. The social geography of those two positions, in 1877, in Wyoming Territory, in a world that had very specific expectations about the directions in which attachment was permissible. It was not a simple thing, not a thing you walked into without knowing what it might cost. She thought about what it might cost. She picked up her pen and finished the letter. Robert Mercer died on a Wednesday in the second week of June. It wasn't unexpected. They'd known it was coming, and the knowing had given the ranch a particular quality for the past several weeks, a held-breath quality, everything continuing, but all of it braced. He'd been mostly confined to bed since April, and Colton had taken to sitting with him in the evenings, and sometimes when she passed the hallway, she could hear the low murmur of their conversation, and she made sure to pass quietly. He died in the early morning before the ranch was awake, which was perhaps how he'd wanted it. Robert Mercer had not, from everything she'd observed, been a man who wanted to be witnessed in vulnerability. Colton came to her office that morning. He looked tired in a way that was different from his usual tiredness, older, settled, like something had shifted in his weight. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. He turned his hat in his hands. The same gesture she'd seen Burkett make, she realized, this particular male expression of not knowing what to do with your hands when you're feeling something. "He asked about you," Colton said finally. "Last week. He asked if you were staying." She hadn't known that. She waited. "I told him yes." He looked up. "Was I right?" She thought about what the question contained. All of it. The ranch, the work, the conversation she hadn't had with herself yet. The one with him she hadn't had either. "Yes," she said. "You were right." He nodded again and sat for a while longer, and she didn't fill the silence, and that was the right thing to do, so. The month after Robert Mercer's death was one of the harder ones, in the quiet, administrative way that death creates work for the living. Probate deeds, accounts, notifications. There was a great deal of paper involved in the transfer of a ranch from one owner to the next, and she handled most of it because that was her job and because Colton was managing everything else. He was also managing the resistance. It came from outside more than inside now. 3 neighboring ranchers, men who'd had cordial working relationships with Robert Mercer, had taken Colton's formal assumption of ownership as an occasion to revisit various agreements with a skepticism they hadn't shown his father. One challenged a grazing boundary that had been settled for a decade. Another let an annual payment arrangement lapse, and when contacted, expressed uncertainty about whether the prior arrangement had been properly formalized. She watched Colton navigate it. He was good at it, better than he'd been in the winter, she thought, more certain of his own ground. But it wore on him. She could see it in the evenings, the specific tiredness of a man who'd spent all day being tested and hadn't been able to stop being tested long enough to rest. One evening in late July, she found him on the porch after supper, sitting on the steps with a coffee cup he'd largely forgotten about, looking out at the north pasture in the long summer light. She sat down on the step beside him, not at a deliberate distance, not pressed close, just beside him, in the natural way of 2 people who had been working alongside each other for 10 months and had stopped performing their distance. "The Harlan letter," she said. "I drafted a response. It's in the office when you want it." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow." They sat. The north pasture went gold in the evening light. A pair of hawks turned slow circles above the far tree line. "My father built this from nothing," Colton said. He wasn't really talking to her. Or not only to her, came out here in 1851 with 2 horses and a plan. Spent 25 years making it into something. He paused. "And now I have men who knew him questioning whether they should bother honoring what he built." "They're testing you," she said. "It's not about your father." "I know. When they find out you don't move, they'll find another test." He looked at her sideways. "I'm not naive about it." "No?" She paused. "You're not naive about most things." He turned slightly to look at her more directly, and she held it, and the evening light was doing something specific to the quality of the air between them. Warm, clear, with that particular stillness that Wyoming evenings sometimes had, when the wind stopped and the land went quiet, and you could hear the grass. "Evelyn," he said. "Colton." He almost smiled at that, at her using his name immediately back, which was something she'd been doing for months without quite realizing it had become a thing. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to tell me the truth, even if the truth is that I've misread everything." Her heart moved in a way she'd been half expecting and half dreading. "All right, He stopped, tried again. "I am not someone who does this easily, saying a thing before I'm sure of the ground." He looked out at the pasture, then back at her. "But I've been sure of this for a long time, and I keep finding reasons to wait, and I'm tired of finding reasons to wait." She said nothing. She let him get there. I think about you, he said, plainly, without drama. Considerably more than is professional. I think about what you think about things. I think about the way you talk, the way you make decisions. I think... He stopped again, and she could see it costing him, this stripping away of the careful. I think I have been falling in love with you since February, and I don't know what to do about it, except stop pretending I'm not. The honesty of it was so clean and so unadorned that it sat between them for a moment before she could do anything with it. She felt the familiar pull toward caution, the practical objections, the social arithmetic, the careful folding away of things that were too large for their container. She felt all of it, and then she thought about the water hauling and the ledgers and the roof collapse and the letter about the creek and the coffee at 9 in the evening and 43 cents in her pocket on a wagon in the middle of Wyoming. And she thought about what her father used to say about words that only mean something when you actually say them. Colton, she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. I've been in love with you since the North Pasture in November, when you stood in the cold and told me you didn't want to be right about something that was hurting you, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to say it, and because I was afraid. He looked at her. I'm still afraid, she said. I want you to know that. This isn't something I know how to do. And there are things that are complicated about it that aren't going to become uncomplicated just because we've said them out loud. I know, he said. The hands will... I know. The neighboring ranchers will use it against you, the ones who are already... Evelyn. He said her name with a quietness that stopped her. I know all of it. I've been thinking about all of it for months. He paused. I'm asking you if you want to face it, not whether it's simple. She looked at him. This man who'd given her a shovel and a ledger and the rarest thing, which was the simple dignity of being seen accurately. And she made the decision that she'd been circling for months, the one that had been building in all those late evenings and long silences and careful, charged conversations. Yes, she said, I want to face it. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the porch steps in the long Wyoming evening while the light went slowly out of the sky, and neither of them said anything more for a while, because some things don't need more words once they've been said correctly. They didn't hide it, which was the right decision and also the harder one. The ranch hands found out over the course of a week, in the organic way that a small, contained community always finds things out, through observation and inference, and Dolores, who told Clara, who was apparently incapable of keeping that kind of information to herself for more than 48 hours. The responses were what she'd expected, and also not entirely what she'd expected. Aldridge said nothing directly, but the set of his face when he spoke to her shifted slightly. More direct, less like he was waiting to see how long she'd last. Dolores said, without looking up from the stove, About time. Clara hugged her, which was startling and unexpectedly welcome. Burkett looked at her for a long moment at supper the evening after it became common knowledge, and then he looked at Colton, and then he went back to his food without expression. After supper, he stopped at the office door. I want you to know, he said, that it don't change anything for me. About the work. I know, she said. Thank you. He nodded and left, and she thought that was probably the most Burkett would ever say about it, and it was enough. The external community was harder, and she'd known it would be. The first time she accompanied Colton to a rancher's meeting in town, not as his employee but at his specific invitation, as the person who managed Blackthorn's accounts, and whose presence was professionally relevant, she felt the quality of the room shift when they walked in together, the particular recalibration of a social space encountering something it hadn't organized a category for yet. Two men she didn't know found reasons to address their questions about ranch business past her to Colton, even when the questions were about records she managed, and he'd need to ask her to answer anyway. A third, a man named Whitmore, who she'd known about long before she met him, shook Colton's hand and then looked at her with a smile that was technically polite and actually something else entirely. This is Evelyn Hartwell, Colton said. She manages Blackthorn's financial operations and administration. Not my companion or my friend or any softening designation. Just her name and her role stated with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which he stated everything. Whitmore's smile didn't change. Capable woman, he said. Yes, Colton said. She is. She met Whitmore's eyes directly and kept her face neutral, and after a moment he looked away first, and she filed that in the same place she filed other small, hard-won things. The drive back to the ranch that evening was quiet for the first few miles. the wagon moving through the dusk with the easy pace of horses who knew the road. That went about as expected, she said finally. Most of it. He was looking at the road. Whitmore will be a problem. Whitmore was already a problem, a different kind now. He paused. He'll use this. The association. Try to frame it as, I know what he'll try to frame it as. She looked at the darkening hills. We already know how to respond to Whitmore. Documented, legal, correct. It worked before. He glanced at her. You're not rattled. I didn't say I wasn't rattled. She pulled her coat closer against the evening cold. I said I know how to respond. He reached across and put his hand briefly over hers, just for a moment, the way people do when they want to say something that doesn't have words yet. Then he put it back on the reins. We'll be all right, he said. She thought about the ledgers and the water rights and the cookhouse roof, and 43 cents in a coat pocket on a cattle wagon rolling into the Wyoming territory with nothing behind her and no way to know what was ahead. Yes, she said, I think we will. The horses moved through the last of the evening light, carrying them home. They were married in October, 13 months after Evelyn Hartwell had arrived at Blackthorn Ranch with 43 cents and a satchel held together by wire. The ceremony was small because neither of them wanted it large, and because a large wedding required a kind of social performance that neither of them had the patience for. The justice of the peace came out from town on a Thursday morning. Aldridge and Dolores stood as witnesses. Clara cried, which she'd apparently been planning to do regardless of the occasion's scale. Burkett stood in the back of the room with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who found himself unexpectedly moved and wasn't sure what to do about it. Evelyn wore her good wool dress, dark green, the one she'd bought in Cheyenne the previous winter, because she didn't have anything that could be called a wedding dress, and hadn't wanted to spend money acquiring one when the wool dress was perfectly serviceable and fit her well. Colton wore a clean shirt and his good boots, and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for months, which was to say with the full, specific attention that she still hadn't entirely gotten used to, even after everything. It was not a romantic ceremony. The justice of the peace had a cold and spoke through it with phlegmatic determination, mispronounced her name twice, and dropped his notes at a critical moment, which required a 20-second pause that Clara filled by sniffling loudly. When it was over, Dolores produced a cake she'd been secretly making for 2 days, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the windows. And it was imperfect and real, and hers in a way that grand ceremonies are never really anyone's. Colton's hand found hers under the table at some point, while Aldridge was telling a story she'd already heard twice, and she let it stay there, and the warmth of it was the particular warmth of a thing that fit exactly as it was supposed to fit. You're thinking, he said to her quietly, under the noise of Aldridge's story. I'm always thinking. What about? She looked around this kitchen, Dolores refilling coffee with her brisk efficiency, Clara still wiping her eyes. Burkett eating cake with the focused commitment of a man making the most of an occasion, and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not happiness exactly, though it contained that. Something more durable. About how I almost didn't come, she said, to Wyoming. There was a position in Philadelphia, a merchant's account, safer, easier. What made you choose Wyoming? The advertisement said respectable employment, and the Philadelphia position didn't mention it at all. She looked at him. I thought anyone who felt the need to specify respectable was at least aware of the concept. He absorbed this. And was it? Respectable? She thought about Hatch, and the water barrels, and the 3 days sleeping in a room the size of a closet before she'd earned anything better. Eventually, she said. He raised his coffee cup slightly, and she raised hers, and they drank, and Aldridge finished his story, and everyone laughed, and outside the Wyoming October did what it always did. Indifferent, demanding, exactly itself. The first year of this marriage taught her things about partnership that no one had ever explained to her, possibly because most of the people she'd known had never experienced it. It was not always easy. Colton was a man with opinions, strong ones, arrived at through careful thought, which made them harder to argue with than opinions that were simply stubborn. He had a particular blindness about cost management that came from having grown up in a family where the land itself was the wealth. He thought in terms of acreage and herd numbers, and struggled to see the smaller expenditures that accumulated into significant losses over a quarter. She thought in terms of line items and ratios, and sometimes struggled to see why the feel of a thing mattered as much as its measurable value. They disagreed about money approximately twice a month, and about other things less often, but with equal completeness. The east pasture fence, she said, one February evening over the account books. You want to rebuild it this spring. The posts are rotting, some of them, 4 sections of the south-facing stretch. The rest have 3, maybe 4 years. She turned the ledger toward him. If we rebuild the whole fence this spring, we're looking at $230. If we replace the failing sections now and schedule the full rebuild for 1880, we spend $80 this year and plan for the rest. And if we have a hard winter in 1879 and the deterioration accelerates, then we reassess in 1879. She held his gaze. You can't build against every contingency at once. We barely broke even on last year's cattle sale because of the summer feed costs. We need to be careful. He looked at the numbers. He didn't like them. She could see that. But he was a man who could be moved by a well-constructed argument, which was one of the things she'd come to value most about him. 4 sections now? He said finally. 4 sections now, she agreed. He leaned back. You know, my father used to say that the fastest way to go broke on the frontier was to fix everything at once. Your father was right. Don't tell Aldridge I agreed with you. He has a bet running about how often that happens. What are the terms of the bet? I've been told not to ask. She almost laughed. Almost because she was still, 2 years into knowing him, occasionally surprised by the specific dry humor of him, the way it appeared without warning between the practical and the serious. It was one of the things she loved about him. She'd made a partial list once, not deliberately, just as a way of understanding her own mind, and it had gotten longer than she'd expected before she'd stopped. The horse breeding program started that same spring, which was her idea and which Colton met with initial skepticism that she'd anticipated and prepared for. She'd been watching the ranch's horse stock for over a year. The quarter horses they used for cattle work, solid and serviceable but unremarkable, and the 2 good mares that had come with the land purchase 2 years prior. Mares that had something in their movement and conformation that the ranch horses lacked. She'd been reading what she could find about breeding programs, which wasn't much. Most of the relevant knowledge lived in the heads of men who'd spent decades in the practice rather than in books. But she'd also been talking to the hands, specifically to a wrangler named Felix, who'd worked for a horse operation in Texas before coming north, and who had opinions about bloodlines that he'd never found anyone interested in hearing before. Quarter horse stock with better conformation, she said to Colton, showing him the figures she'd worked up over 3 weeks. The right breeding, over 2 or 3 generations, produces an animal that can work cattle all day and still cover ground faster than what we're running now. Better horses mean better cattle work. Better cattle work means we can manage a larger herd with the same number of hands. Horse breeding takes years to show results. Everything worth building takes years. She kept her voice even. You know that better than I do. He looked at the papers. You've talked to Felix. At length. Felix has been here 8 months. Felix knows more about horse bloodlines than anyone else on this ranch. She waited. The question isn't whether he's been here long. The question is whether he's right. Colton picked up the breeding outline she'd drafted. 5 pages, specific, costed, with a realistic timeline that didn't oversell the early years, and read it with the thorough attention he gave to everything that mattered. She sat across from him and didn't fill the silence. When he set it down, he said, You've thought about this for a long time. About a year. Why didn't you bring it before? Because last year we were managing a drought, and a foreman's theft, and your father's estate, and a water rights dispute. She looked at him steadily. I picked my moment. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the specific appreciation of a person who recognizes a kind of intelligence they respect. 2 mares to start, he said, and we bring Felix into the management of it formally. I was going to suggest the same thing. I know. He almost smiled. You were going to let me suggest it first. I was, she admitted. Why? Because it costs you less if it feels like a shared decision than if it feels like you were convinced. He looked at her for a long moment. That's practical. I was going to say perceptive, he paused, and slightly irritating. Both can be true. Pierce Whitmore made his move in the summer of 1878, and he made it the way men like Whitmore always made their moves, not directly, not in a way that could be clearly called what it was, but through accumulated pressure applied at the right points. It started with the water. The Northern Tributary Agreement that Colton had negotiated the previous year shared a boundary point with a section of land that Whitmore had quietly purchased in the spring. Whitmore's new land didn't give him legal standing to affect the water arrangement, but it gave him proximity, and proximity was what he needed. By June, his hands were grazing cattle on the boundary in ways that weren't technically trespass, but were close enough to require Aldridge to redirect Blackthorn's herd management twice a week to avoid conflict. Then came the offer. It arrived as a letter, formally written, from Whitmore's attorney in Cheyenne. An offer to purchase 400 acres of Blackthorn's northeastern grazing land at a price that was, technically, fair, possibly even slightly above market. The letter was polite, professional, and understood by everyone who read it to mean, I intend to own that land eventually. The question is whether you sell it on your terms or mine. Colton brought the letter to the office and handed it to her without comment. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the land map on the wall. The northeastern section is our primary buffer between Whitmore's land and the northern tributary access point, she said. Yes. If he owns it, he can pressure the tributary arrangement from two sides. Yes. He's not buying land, he's buying leverage. That's how I read it. He sat down. We can't sell it. No. She looked at the map. But we need to think about why he's doing this now. Why 1878? Colton was quiet for a moment. Cattle prices are up. The ranch is showing well. We've got the horse program starting. From the outside, we look like we're growing. He paused. Which means our land is worth more than it was 2 years ago. And if someone wanted to acquire us by pieces, start with a reasonable offer on a peripheral section. Get a foothold. Use it to pressure the next section. That's Whitmore's arithmetic. She turned from the map. He's patient. He's been patient about the creek for 4 years. What do we do? She'd been thinking about this since the letter arrived, the way she thought about things she knew were coming before they arrived, quietly, in the background, building the answer before she had to give it. We formalize the northeastern section, she said. Have the attorney file an amended land description that explicitly documents the section's connection to our water access rights. Make the record clear enough that any future buyer would inherit our water rights dispute along with the land. It makes the section less attractive to purchase for leverage purposes. That kind of filing takes time, 3 weeks if we push it. She picked up her pen. And we send Whitmore's attorney a letter declining the offer. Polite, specific, and with a reference to our intention to develop the northeastern section for the horse program. Make it clear we have plans for it. Do we have plans for it? We do now. She looked at him. Felix mentioned last month that additional pasture with better grass cover would help the breeding program. I've been thinking about it since. This accelerates the timeline. Colton watched her. You were already planning this before the letter. I was planning the pasture development. The letter changed the urgency. She held his gaze. Whitmore is going to be a problem for years. Every time we shore up one position, he'll find another angle. The only permanent answer is to build the ranch to a size and legal standing that makes the harassment not worth his effort. That's a long game. I know. She didn't look away. Are you prepared to play it? I was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through it. Not the legal question or the strategic one, but something deeper, the question underneath those questions. About commitment, about what you were building, and whether you were building it to last. Yes, he said. Then let's start with the letter. The letter went out that week. The legal filing took 4 weeks, not 3, because the Cheyenne attorney had a backlog, and because documentation that was meant to hold up to scrutiny had to be done correctly. But it was filed and recorded, and Whitmore's attorney sent a brief acknowledgement that said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. The pressure on the northern boundary eased, gradually. Not immediately, not dramatically, just the slow withdrawal of a hand that had found the door locked. The horse breeding program had its first real success in the fall of 1878, when the first foal from the new program was born, a dark bay filly that Felix declared, with an emotion she'd never seen in him before, to be the finest built animal he'd seen come out of a Wyoming ranch. She went to the corral to see it the morning it was born, stood at the fence in the autumn cold with her coat pulled tight, and watched the filly find its legs with the ungainly, determined effort of something new to the world. Colton came to stand beside her. She's good, he said, looking at the filly. Yes. Felix is going to be insufferable about this. Felix has earned it. She watched the filly take a few more steps, Stumble, correct. She's going to be something. You can tell that from here? I've been studying the paperwork on the bloodlines for a year. She glanced at him. And Felix told me this morning, in detail, for approximately 40 minutes. He laughed. A real one. Unpracticed. The kind that came from somewhere genuine. She loved that laugh. It was one of the things on the list. The winter of 1878 was harder than the previous two, and for the first time in memory it was hard in the right way. Cold enough, wet enough, the snowpack building slowly in the hills the way it was supposed to. The southern creek recovered by spring. The north pastures came in greener than they'd been in 3 years. She was in her 4th month of pregnancy by February, which she'd known since December and told Colton the same evening she was certain, sitting across from him at the office desk with the lamp between them and the wind doing its usual work on the eaves. He'd gone very still when she told him. "Are you all right?" she'd asked, because the stillness was hard to read. "Yes." He looked up from whatever middle distance he'd been staring at. Yes." He reached across the desk and took her hand. "Are you?" "I'm nauseous in the mornings and I've had a headache for 6 days," she said. "Otherwise, yes. You should rest more." "I should work the same amount I always work and also rest more. I'll figure out the arithmetic." "Evelyn, I'm not fragile." She kept her voice firm but not hard. "I know you want to protect me from things. I know that comes from where it comes from. But I need you to let me manage my own body. I'll tell you if I need help." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "But tell me." "I'll tell you." He held her hand for another moment. "A child," he said, with a quietness that had wonder in it without being sentimental. "Yes." She let herself feel it, the enormity of it, the particular combination of joy and terror that she suspected was the honest experience of impending parenthood, as opposed to the story people told about it. "Terrifying," she said. "Yes." He looked at her directly. "We'll be all right." "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." Oh. Their daughter was born in July 1879, in the middle of a heat wave, with a difficulty that nobody afterward wanted to talk about much. 14 hours, a doctor brought from town at speed, 2 moments where the doctor's face went a particular color that she registered even through the fog of pain and exhaustion and filed as information she would think about later. She didn't die. The daughter didn't die. Those were the relevant facts. She named her Margaret, after nobody in particular. Just a name she'd always liked, a name that sounded like it belonged to a person with opinions. Colton had suggested his mother's name, Eleanor, and they'd talked about it and settled on Margaret Eleanor, which satisfied everyone including Dolores, who had declared the name Eleanor to be unlucky based on criteria she didn't explain. Margaret had Colton's dark hair and an expression of constant critical assessment that Dolores said she must have gotten from Evelyn, though Evelyn privately thought it was simply the look of a person encountering the world for the first time and finding it both insufficient and interesting. The ranch kept moving through it all, the way the ranch always moved. The cattle, the records, the fence line negotiations, the horse program expanding into its 2nd year with 2 more mares and Felix's growing confidence. She was back at her desk 6 weeks after Margaret was born, which was 2 weeks earlier than the doctor had recommended, and 4 weeks earlier than Colton had hoped. But she'd been running the records from the bedroom for the preceding 2 weeks anyway, so the desk felt like a concession more than a return. "You're impossible," Colton told her, on her first morning back in the office. "I'm efficient." She settled Margaret in the small wooden cradle that Pete Dawes had built and left outside the office door one morning without comment. "And I had 3 invoices pile up that Aldridge clearly didn't know what to do with." Colton looked at the cradle, then at Margaret, then at Evelyn. "Pete made that," she said. "I know. I saw him working on it." His voice was odd for a moment. Not bad odd, the other kind. "He didn't say anything to anyone." "No." She picked up the first invoice. "He didn't have to." The summer of 1880 brought 2 things of consequence: a second pregnancy, which announced itself in May, and Pierce Whitmore's final attempt at Blackthorn land. He'd been quiet for 2 years, long enough that she'd been watching for it, because men like Whitmore weren't capable of being finished, only of waiting. When it came, it was through a different channel than she'd expected. A rumor, spread through the county with the efficiency of something deliberately seeded, that Blackthorn Ranch was over-leveraged on its horse breeding program and was quietly looking for buyers for its northern acreage. It was a lie, constructed with enough specificity to be plausible. The horse program had required investment. That was documented fact. The investment had been planned and budgeted and was already showing returns in the sale of 2 trained horses at prices that had made Felix stand in the pasture looking at the sky for a solid minute when she told him. But it looked, from outside, if you wanted it to look a certain way, like a risky expenditure on a non-traditional program by a woman who'd talked her husband into it. She heard the rumor from Clara, who heard it from a Hand's wife in town, who heard it from someone who'd heard it from someone in Whitmore's social orbit. She sat with it for 1 day before she did anything, which was the longest she'd ever sat with something that required a response. Then she went to the office, pulled 2 years of breeding program records, the sale documentation for the 2 horses, the development plans for the northeastern pasture, and the current cattle valuation report. And she drafted a letter to the Sweetwater County Bank, with whom the Mercer family had maintained accounts for 20 years, requesting a formal meeting to present Blackthorn Ranch's current financial standing. Colton read the draft that evening. "You want to go to the bank," he said. "I want to put our financial health on formal record with the institution that the county's ranching community most pays attention to." She looked at him steadily. "Whitmore's rumor only works if there's no counter record. We create the counter record. And if the bank meeting surfaces anything negative, it won't. The numbers are good. The horse program is ahead of its projected return by 1/4. The cattle valuation is the highest it's been in 5 years. She paused. "I've been building toward this for 2 years without knowing it would be necessary. The records say exactly what they need to say." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about Whitmore for 2 years. I've been thinking about the ranch's documented strength for 2 years. Whitmore is what makes it necessary to use it." He looked at her, that full, specific look, and she saw something in it that was beyond the particular love she'd spent 3 years getting used to, something more like awe, which embarrassed her in a way love didn't. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "I'll try." The bank meeting was scheduled for the 2nd week of August. She presented the documentation herself, sitting across a wide mahogany desk from the bank's senior officer, a man named Harold Pruitt, who had the careful neutrality of someone who dealt in other people's difficulties professionally. Colton sat beside her. She spoke for 45 minutes and answered questions for 20 more, and Pruitt's neutrality shifted, by the end, into something she recognized as professional respect. "Your records are unusually thorough," he said, as they were preparing to leave. "I was trained to be thorough," she said. "By whom, if I may ask?" She thought of her father and his print shop and the letters she'd rewritten until they said exactly what they meant, and nothing else. "By someone who believed that how you present a thing tells people as much as the thing itself," she said. Pruitt nodded slowly. He was right. The rumor faded over the following weeks, the way rumors fade when they can't find purchase. Not with drama, not with confrontation, just a gradual withdrawing of attention from a story that had stopped being interesting. She heard, through Clara's reliable network, that Whitmore had made an offer on the land of a smaller rancher to the west. She filed that information and moved on. By September, she was showing with the 2nd pregnancy and had reorganized the office filing system for the 3rd time in 4 years, and had formally proposed to Colton that Felix be made head of a standalone horse operation, separate from the general ranch management, with its own budget line and its own small staff. "That's a significant structural change," Colton said. "The program is outgrowing the structure we built for it." She put the proposal on the desk. "This is what it becomes if we let it be what it is." He read through it. Outside, the autumn wind was doing its first serious work on the trees, pulling the last warmth from the season with cheerful indifference. "You know what my father would say about this?" he said, not looking up. "What?" "He'd say you think like a rancher." He put the proposal down and looked at her. "I think that would be the highest compliment he could give." "What do you think?" He picked it up again. "I think you're right, and I think Felix is going to actually cry when we tell him. He'll deny it. Absolutely." He signed the bottom of the proposal. "But he'll cry. The 2nd child, a boy, Thomas Robert Mercer, the Robert for the grandfather who'd asked whether she was staying and trusted her answer, was born in January 1881, in a winter that was cold and wet, and exactly as it should be, the snowpack building properly in the hills, the creek levels rising toward what they needed to be. She held Thomas in the lamplight of the room that had once been a storage partition, with a window the size of a book, which was now, because they'd been building, something larger, something warmer, something that was unmistakably home, and she thought about 43 cents and a cattle wagon and a foreman who'd looked at her like livestock and a ledger with a seam in it, and she thought about all the distances between that woman and this one, and they were not the distances of luck or of rescue, but of work and choice, and the slow accumulation of days on which she had refused to be less than what she was. Colton came in quietly and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son in the way he'd looked at his daughter, with that wondering stillness that she'd stopped trying to categorize and had simply learned to love. "How are you?" he asked. "Tired," she said. "Good tired." "Thomas Robert," he said. "Thomas Robert." She looked down at the baby. "He looks like you. He looks like a very small, very angry person." "Yes." She felt the almost laugh. "Like you." He reached over and tucked the blanket more firmly around Thomas, the gesture so practiced and gentle that she thought about how people become things they weren't born knowing how to be, how the becoming happens in small daily acts rather than in transformations. How Colton Mercer had been a good man learning to be a father, the same way she'd been a determined woman learning to be home. Outside, the January wind moved across the Wyoming territory with its usual absence of apology, but inside the lamp held its light, and the ranch went on in the darkness around them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The years did not pass gently. They rarely do, on the frontier or anywhere else, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't been paying attention. They pass the way hard things pass, with weight, with accumulation, with the slow grinding of seasons that took something from you every year, and occasionally, if you'd worked for it, gave something back. By 1890, Blackthorn Ranch ran 800 head of cattle and maintained a horse breeding operation that had become, in Felix's capable and obsessive hands, one of the most respected in Sweetwater County. Felix had never cried the day they told him about the standalone operation, exactly as predicted, though Clara had reported with great authority that she'd seen him standing alone in the east pasture for a long time afterward with his back to the barn, which everyone understood to mean the same thing. He'd been at Blackthorn for 12 years by then and showed no inclination to go anywhere else, which Evelyn privately considered one of her better decisions. Margaret was 11 and Thomas was 9, and they were, as children of people with strong personalities tend to be, themselves in specific and occasionally exhausting ways. Margaret had inherited her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness in a combination that made her simultaneously the most organized and the most immovable person in any room she entered. Thomas was quieter, more watchful, with a quality of patient observation that made adults forget he was in the room and then discover, disconcertingly, that he'd been listening to everything. Evelyn had delivered a third child, a girl named Ruth, in 1884, and lost her at 4 months to a fever that arrived without warning and could not be turned. That loss lived in her in a place she didn't discuss, and had learned not to approach head-on, the way you learn not to look directly at certain kinds of light. Colton carried it differently. She could see it in him on certain evenings, a quality of stillness that meant he was thinking about Ruth, and on those evenings she would simply sit near him, because nearness was the only honest comfort, and she'd long since stopped pretending that words could do the work nearness did. They had learned, over the years, how to carry things together without requiring each other to perform recovery they didn't feel. Pierce Whitmore had finally, in 1886, sold his operation and moved south. She'd heard about it through Aldridge, who'd heard it from a hand who'd ridden in from town, and she'd received the information at her desk with the same expression she gave most news. Still, considering, filing, and then said to Colton that evening, "Whitmore sold." "I heard," he said. "Good." Yes. That was the extent of the conversation, which was exactly the right length for it. Sam Aldridge retired in the spring of 1891, which was not a surprise. He'd been slowing visibly for 2 years, his joints giving him trouble in the cold, in a way he didn't complain about, but that you could see in how he moved on winter mornings. They held a supper for him. The whole ranch gathered in the cookhouse, and Dolores cooked everything he'd ever mentioned liking over 15 years of conversation, which was a more impressive feat of accumulated listening than it appeared. Aldridge stood at the end of the table and looked at all of them with the expression of a man who hadn't planned to feel as much as he was feeling, and said, "I didn't expect to stay this long when I came. I expected to stay a season." He stopped, cleared his throat. "This place got into me." Evelyn understood that completely. They promoted a man named Harlan Dews, young, 26, born in Wyoming and trained on it, to foreman, which caused a brief resistance among two of the older hands that she and Colton talked through separately with each of them over the course of a week, patiently, without ultimatums, in the way they'd learned to handle resistance on the ranch, not by forcing it, but by explaining the reasoning and trusting that most people, when given the full picture, could find their way to the right position. Both hands came around. It didn't always work that way. This time it did. Harlan Dew's was good, not Aldridge's kind of good, which was the settled, weathered competence of someone who'd solved every problem before, but the good of someone young enough to still see problems freshly, which had its own value. He made mistakes. He knew he made mistakes and said so, which Evelyn considered the more important quality. "He reminds me of you," she told Colton one evening. "He makes more mistakes than I did." "That's because he admits them." She looked up from her book. "You used to fix yours before anyone noticed. That's not the same thing as not making them." He was quiet for a moment. "That's accurate." "I know. You don't have to sound quite so satisfied about it." "I've been right about things for 15 years, she said. "I've earned a certain amount of satisfaction." He turned the page of his own book. "You were wrong about the east fence posts in '82. The posts were structurally compromised. My assessment of the timeline was off, not my assessment of the problem." "That's a fine distinction." "All meaningful distinctions are fine." She looked at him over her book. "That's what makes them meaningful." He smiled. Not the almost smile, the full one, the one she'd been collecting for years, the one that still did the same thing it had always done to the specific region of her chest where she kept things she couldn't entirely explain. The trouble came into winter of 1893, the way real trouble tends to come, from a direction you'd been watching and from one you hadn't simultaneously. The direction she'd been watching was economic. The cattle market had been softening for 2 years, prices driven down by oversupply, and a railroad system that was changing the math of ranching across the territory. She'd been tracking it in the quarterly reports, adjusting projections, having the same conversation with Colton every few months that arrived at the same careful conclusion. They needed to diversify further, reduce dependence on the cattle market's volatility, build more value into the horse operation. The direction she hadn't been watching was Colton's heart. He came in from a morning ride in late November and sat at the kitchen table and didn't get up again. Not dramatically. Not a fall, not a collapse. He just sat and said his chest felt strange, and she looked at his face and sent Thomas to town for the doctor at a pace that required no explanation. The doctor, a man named Pierce, who had been practicing in Sweetwater County for 8 years and had the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen enough emergencies to stop performing alarm about them, spent an hour with Colton and came to find her in the hallway afterward. "His heart is working harder than it should," Pierce said. "He needs to rest. Not ranch rest, real rest. Less riding, less physical work, and less—" He looked at her with the directness she'd always appreciated in him. "Less carrying, the kind that doesn't show." "How serious?" Pierce was quiet for a moment. "Serious enough to take seriously." She held that. "What does he do?" "Less. More slowly." He picked up his bag. "Men who've run ranches all their lives are not good at less. You know him better than I do." She did know him. She knew exactly how he would receive this information and what it would cost him, because she knew what the ranch meant to him. Not as possession, but as identity, as the physical expression of everything his father had built and everything he'd defended and expanded, the place where his hands had always known what to do. Telling Colton Mercer to do less on Blackthorn Ranch was like telling a river to flow more politely. She went in and sat on the edge of the bed and told him what Pierce had said, plainly, without softening or inflating. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Less. Less. The spring count, I'll run it. The north fence inspection. Harlan and Thomas." She held his gaze. "Thomas is 17. He knows the fence line better than most of the hands." Colton looked at her. "You've already thought through all of it." "I had an hour in the hallway. I was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the November wind moved through the yard in the familiar way, indifferent, exactly itself. "I'm not good at this." "I know." She didn't pretend otherwise. "You'll do it anyway." "Will I?" "Yes." She reached over and took his hand. "Because you're not going to leave your children before you have to, and you're not going to leave me." He looked at her. Directly, fully, the way he'd looked at her in the office on the morning she'd shown him the first evidence of Hatch's theft, the recording look, The one that meant something was going somewhere specific in him. No, he said quietly. I'm not going to do that. The following years reorganized the ranch in ways she hadn't anticipated, and in ways she had. Thomas took to the physical management of Blackthorn with a thoroughness that would have surprised people who remembered his quietness as a child, if they'd forgotten that quiet people are often simply storing what they'll need later. At 17, he knew every fence line and water source on 6,000 acres. At 19, he was riding with Harlan on the cattle decisions with a judgment that was already good and would be better. He had his father's patience and his mother's precision, which was a combination the ranch had been built on, and which suited it in the way that places sometimes pass their requirements down through families, selecting for what they need. Margaret went east for 2 years, a women's college in Ohio, an argument Evelyn had been making to Colton since Margaret was 14, and that he'd been resisting out of a reluctance she understood and didn't accept. The argument she'd finally made that moved him was simple. She is who I was at 14, Colton. Do you want to tell her there's a ceiling? He hadn't answered that question because it didn't have a good answer. Margaret came back in 1896, not because she was required to, but because she chose to, which was the way Evelyn had always hoped it would go. She came back with a year of accounting training and opinions about land management that she expressed without preamble to anyone who seemed relevant, which was very specifically her mother's daughter, and also very specifically herself. She argued with Harlan for 40 minutes yesterday about the grazing rotation, Colton told Evelyn. With the expression of a man who was mostly amused and partly exhausted. Was she right? Substantially. Did Harlan admit it? He said she made some valid points, which from Harlan is the same as saying she was right. Then I don't see the problem, Evelyn said. Colton gave her a long look. I remember a man named Hatch who had a version of that same conversation. And how did that turn out? He conceded the point by not answering it, which had become, over 20 years, one of their more efficient forms of communication. So, Colton died in March of 1901, on a morning when the first real warmth of the year had finally pushed through the cold, and the light on the north pasture had the quality that Wyoming light gets in early spring, clean and flat and slightly unreal, like the land is still deciding whether to commit to the season. He died the way he'd lived, without excessive drama, in his own bed, with his family around him and the ranch still running in the yard outside the window. His heart, which had been working harder than it should for 8 years, simply stopped finding the effort worth continuing. Pierce said he had been sleeping and likely felt nothing, which was the thing doctors say, and which may even have been true. She sat with him for a long time after, in the quiet of the room, while downstairs the house held its breath around her grief. The grief was real and total, and she didn't perform it for anyone. It arrived like the Wyoming winter she'd first encountered. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, as if it had been waiting just outside the door. She let it in. She let it move through her and take what it needed because she'd learned, with Ruth and with years of smaller losses, that grief does not shorten when you fight it. It only goes underground, where it finds other ways out. She did not stop working. This was not a refusal to grieve. It was the way her grief expressed itself and always had, not through stillness, but through motion, through the continuation of the thing that had been built, through honoring the 24 years of partnership by treating its product as worth protecting. The ranch was the physical record of everything they had built together. Letting it diminish would be the one kind of faithlessness she couldn't forgive herself. Thomas was 20 years old and capable, and she trusted him completely with the cattle operations and the land management decisions. She stayed in the office. The records were hers. The correspondence was hers. The financial standing of Blackthorn Ranch. Through the economic turbulences of the early century, through the slow transformation of the frontier into something more organized and less raw, that remained in her hands, and her hands did not shake. Margaret ran the horse operation after Felix finally, reluctantly, at the age of 63, allowed that he was perhaps not moving quite as fast as he once had. She ran it with the aggressive competence of someone who'd been prepared for it her whole life without being told that was what she was being prepared for. And within 3 years, the program was selling trained horses to buyers from as far as Colorado and Montana, names that would have seemed impossible when Evelyn had first proposed 2 mares and a revised pasture plan in 1878. There was a morning in 1907. She was 55 years old, which still surprised her occasionally, the number seeming to belong to someone in a different category. when she rode out to the north pasture before breakfast, which she did sometimes, not for work, but for the thing that wasn't quite named, the way of touching the land that had become its own kind of conversation over the years. The ranch looked different from a horse than it did from the office window. Larger, more physical, more real, in the way that things are more real when you're inside them rather than measuring them. 800 acres of pasture land, the herd moving slow in the morning light, the windmill turning, the bunkhouse showing smoke from the cookhouse chimney. Harlan's replacement, a man named Cord who'd been with them 7 years, would be out shortly with the morning crew. She sat her horse on the rise and looked at it, and thought about a cattle wagon and 43 cents and a Boston coat that wasn't made for Wyoming wind. She thought about her father, who would have found Wyoming interesting. She thought about Colton, who was everywhere on this land in the way that people are everywhere on the places they built. In the fence lines he'd argued about, and the pastures he'd ridden, and the office where they'd sat across from each other with ledgers between them, and said things eventually that they'd been afraid to say. She thought about what it cost to choose something, really choose it, not fall into it, not be carried there by circumstance, but look at it clearly with full awareness of what it would require and say yes with both eyes open. She'd done that with Wyoming and with Colton and with the work, and none of those choices had been safe, and every one of them had been right. This was what she understood now, at 55, on a horse on a rise above the north pasture in the early light, that she hadn't understood at 24 on a cattle wagon coming into Sweetwater County. The choices that look like risks are often the only ones that lead somewhere real. The safe choice, Philadelphia, the merchant's accounts, the respectable and uncomplicated life she could have had, would have been a life, but it would have been a narrow one, built around what she could manage rather than what she could build. She had not known she was capable of building anything until she had no choice but to try. The trying was what it was. It was not graceful. She had been wrong about things. The fence posts, yes, but larger things too, judgments about people and timing, and what the ranch could absorb in a given season. She had been sharp when she should have been patient, and patient when she should have been sharp, and she had carried grief badly for a while, and loved cautiously for longer than she needed to, and she had sometimes let the ledgers stand between her and the harder conversations because numbers were easier than feelings, and she had never fully unlearned that habit. She had also built something that would outlast her. That was not nothing. That was in fact the whole thing. Thomas married in 1905, a woman named Vera from a ranching family in the northern county who had the excellent quality of being completely unintimidated by Evelyn, which Evelyn considered a mandatory requirement and had told Thomas so directly, to his mild embarrassment and Vera's immediate approval. They had 2 children by 1910, and Evelyn watched those grandchildren move through the rooms of the main house, with the comfortable ownership of children who have never known a home to be anything other than theirs. And she thought about what it meant to make a place safe for the people who come after you. Not safe from difficulty. Difficulty was the frontier. Difficulty was life. You didn't protect children from difficulty without making them incapable of it. Safe in the sense of known. In the sense of you belong here. This was built for you. Your presence here is not a question. Margaret never married, which caused a certain amount of county commentary that Margaret received with the same focused indifference she brought to most things that weren't directly relevant to the horse operation. She lived at the ranch and ran the horse program and had opinions about everyone's business and provided, over the decades, a counterweight to the tendency of institutions to calcify. Someone who would walk into any room and ask, without apology, why are we still doing it this way? Evelyn loved her fiercely and found her occasionally exhausting and recognized in her the specific exhaustion of encountering your own strongest qualities in someone else. You know, Thomas told Evelyn once, with the affectionate exasperation of a man with a sister like Margaret, there are people in this county who think she's frightening. Good, Evelyn said. She's supposed to be. She was 63 years old when she finally moved out of the main office. Not retired, not finished, but moved. Because Thomas needed the main office and she no longer needed the largest room to do what she did, which had shifted from management to guidance in the way that transitions shift when you let them happen instead of fighting them. She kept a smaller desk in the room that had once been the storage partition with a window the size of a book. They'd expanded it years ago. The window was larger now, a proper window that looked out onto the north pasture, but she'd chosen to come back to it, which was the kind of thing that only makes sense to you and doesn't require explanation. She still reviewed the quarterly accounts. Thomas still brought her the decisions that felt large and sat across from her while she read through them, the same way she'd sat across from Colton in the office in 1876 with the problem of the ledger discrepancies between them. She still had opinions. She still voiced them. The difference was that now they came from 63 years of living rather than from the compressed urgency of a woman who needed to prove she was worth the space she occupied. She no longer needed to prove that. It was, she reflected, one of the better things that time gave you, if you were paying attention. Harlan Dews came to visit once, in the spring of 1915. He'd retired to a small place outside of town, and he came on a Sunday morning, older and thinner than she remembered, moving carefully on joints that had seen 30 years of ranch work. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee and looked around the room. "It's bigger than it was," he said. "Everything is." "No." He shook his head. "Some things stayed the same." He looked at her directly. "You stayed the same." "I got old." "You stayed yourself." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "That's what I meant. Some people, the years changed them into something different. You just got more of what you already were." She thought about that for a long time after he left. She died in the winter of 1921, which was a hard winter, which seemed appropriate. Wyoming had always communicated with her through its winters, and it would have been odd to go in a gentle season. She was 68 years old. The doctor said her heart, not unlike Colton's, had simply reached the limit of its contract. Thomas was with her. Margaret was with her. Thomas's children, who were 14 and 11 and had her father's dark hair and their grandmother's unnerving tendency to watch and listen and remember everything, were in the house. She had not left a long final statement or a philosophical document. What she left was the ranch, running, solvent, expanded to 11,000 acres, with a horse operation known across 3 states and a reputation for fair dealing that had outlasted every man who'd tried to undermine it. She left a correspondence log going back 45 years, every letter sent and received, organized and annotated in the handwriting that had started as a Boston printer's daughter's careful script and had become, over decades of Wyoming winters, something drier and more direct. She left the deed to the northeastern section, which Whitmore had tried to buy in 1878, with a notation in the margin in her own hand, not for sale, never for sale. She left Margaret a letter, and Thomas a letter, and Vera a letter, and the grandchildren a single letter, addressed to all of them that said, in part, "You were born to something that was built by people who had no guarantee it would work. It worked because they refused to treat failure as the likely outcome. That stubbornness is yours now. Use it." And she left, in the small desk in the room with the north-facing window, still organized, still exactly as she'd kept it, a ledger that had nothing to do with cattle or horses or water rights. It was a personal record, started in the second year of her time at Blackthorn, that she'd kept intermittently ever since. Not a diary. She had no patience for diaries, more like a log. The same format as all her other records, but the subject was different. The entries were short, dated, matter-of-fact in the way she was matter-of-fact about everything. November 12, 1877. Cold. Found the water rights document. Colton looked at it like it was solid ground. July 15, 1879. Margaret born. She cried for an hour straight and then stopped and looked at me like she was evaluating a ledger. March 3, 1901. Colton died this morning. The North Pasture light was the good kind. I think he saw it. September 21, 1907. Rode out early. The ranch looked the way it does when it's being itself. I have never been sorry I came here. The last entry was dated December 1920, 2 months before she died. Thomas asked me today if I was afraid. I said no, and I think I was mostly telling the truth. I am tired in the way that is different from sad. What we built is still standing. That was the whole point. A woman from Boston came out here once with 43 cents and thought she might not survive the winter. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about a number of things, and right about the ones that mattered. I think that's about as well as anyone does. The ledger was found by Margaret, who read it at the small desk by the north window and did not cry, exactly, but sat for a long time with the light coming through the glass and the north pasture going on in its January way, cold, demanding, indifferent, exactly itself. Outside, the ranch continued. The horses moved in the east pasture with the fluid, deliberate grace of animals that had been bred carefully over 40 years toward this specific quality of motion. The cattle were slow and steady in the far field. The windmill turned. The cookhouse showed smoke. The hands went about their morning work in the cold, the way hands on this land had gone about their morning work for 45 years, in all the seasons, through all the things that had come and gone and come again.